Grace froze in place, heart hammering against her ribs as the infamous Mafia boss Vincent Caruso leaned back in his chair, a half-smile playing on his lips. Moments ago, he had casually asked her, a timid waitress, for financial advice, clearly as a joke. His men had snickered, expecting her to mumble an apology and scurry away. Instead, Grace had swallowed her fear and given him an earnest suggestion, her voice steady. Now the entire restaurant was dead silent, all eyes on the stunned crime lord. Caruso swirled the amber liquid in his glass thoughtfully, then uttered a reply that struck Grace like a thunderbolt. She hadn't imagined that her offhand advice would lead to this. The exclusive Italian restaurant Giovanni's hummed with the low murmur of New York's elite winding down their Thursday night. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over linen-draped tables set with gleaming silverware. Impeccably dressed waitstaff glided between tables with practiced grace. For many patrons, this upscale haven was a place to see and be seen. But for a select few, Giovanni's was also considered neutral ground, a safe meeting spot in a city quietly carved up by invisible borders of power and influence. At the edge of the dining room, Grace Delaney smoothed the front of her black apron and took a steadying breath. She had worked at Giovanni's for only 4 months, and still fought the sense that she didn't quite belong among these glittering, high-class surroundings. The 23-year-old waitress had grown up in a much humbler part of town, worlds away from the wealthy financiers and socialites who frequented this place. Each shift left her feeling like an imposter in a borrowed uniform. Yet she needed this job desperately. So every evening Grace mustered a polite smile and did her best to fade into the background. Tonight, however, a ripple of tension charged the air. Grace noticed the restaurant manager nervously straightening his tie over and over, and the head waiter barking hushed instructions at the staff. Something was different. News had filtered through the grapevine that a particularly notorious guest had reserved the private corner table for a late dinner. Even someone like Grace, who tried to avoid the city's rumor mill, had heard the name Vincent Caruso whispered with a mix of fear and awe. Caruso was said to control a significant piece of New York's underworld. Some claimed he ruled it outright alongside a handful of other crime family bosses. Most law-abiding folks only knew him from sensational headlines, if they knew him at all. But those in certain circles understood that where Vincent Caruso went, trouble often followed. And now he was coming here. Grace's stomach fluttered with nerves when she realized she might be serving the Mafia boss's table. She finished polishing a wine glass with trembling fingers. Of all nights to be on duty, of course it had to be this one. Grace desperately hoped to keep her head down and simply survive the evening without incident. Before long, a hush fell over the restaurant as a small entourage strolled in through the ornate double doors. At its center was a tall, broad-shouldered man in an exquisitely tailored charcoal suit. He moved with an unhurried confidence, flanked by several men who scanned the room with sharp, watchful eyes. Grace knew at once who he must be. The photographs in the papers hadn't done Vincent Caruso justice. In person, the Mafia boss had a commanding presence that seemed to charge the very air around him. Dark hair, neatly trimmed and swept back, framed a strong, clean-shaven jaw. He had the kind of striking, cold handsomeness that turned heads. But it was the intensity in his eyes that truly unsettled her. Even from across the room, Grace could feel the weight of that gaze as Caruso briefly surveyed Giovanni's like he owned the place. A hostess escorted Caruso and his party to the secluded corner table that had been prepared for them. Crisp white wine had already been poured into waiting glasses at the place settings. As he sat, Caruso exchanged a few quiet words with an older gentleman by his side. An advisor or bodyguard, Grace guessed. The rest of his men took their seats, the atmosphere at the table tense yet oddly casual, as if this were both a social outing and a business meeting. Grace's throat went dry as the head waiter motioned for her to attend that table. Of course, she was one of the few servers left with an empty tray at the moment, and this table required the most experienced attention. She swallowed hard and approached with her pen and notepad clutched tightly, careful to keep her expression polite and neutral. "Good evening," Grace said softly, willing her voice not to shake as she gave a small nod to the formidable man at the head of the table. "Welcome to Giovanni's. My name is Grace, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight." Her eyes flickered over the group cautiously. Vincent Caruso's steel-gray eyes lifted to Grace, pinning her in place. Under that piercing scrutiny, she felt almost like a butterfly pinned under glass. But he merely gave a curt nod of acknowledgement, allowing her to proceed. Grace recited the evening's specials from memory, her practiced server's smile concealing her nerves. One of the men, a heavy-set guy with a shaved head, cut her off halfway through, barking his drink order without so much as a glance. "Whiskey. The Macallan neat, and keep them coming," he said. Another quickly added, "Make that too." Grace noted the orders with a quick scribble. The others murmured their preferences more politely, perhaps picking up on Caruso's silence and knowing better than to draw attention. Finally, Grace looked to Caruso himself. He had been studying her, one hand idly toying with the base of his wineglass. "And for you, sir?" she asked, amazed at how steady she managed to sound. The corner of his mouth lifted faintly. "Chianti Classico," he replied in a low voice that was surprisingly smooth. "Thank you, Grace." Hearing her name in his mouth sent a strange little jolt through her chest. She quickly bowed her head and stepped away to submit their orders, exhaling shakily the moment she was out of their immediate orbit. As she punched in the drink orders at the waiter's station, Grace's colleague and friend Molly sidled up beside her. Molly's eyes were wide. "You got that table?" she whispered, clearly referring to the Caruso party. Grace just nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. Her hands were trembling slightly as she pressed the buttons on the register. Molly gave her a sympathetic wince. "Be careful, okay? I heard he can be unpredictable. Don't mess up any orders. And definitely don't spill anything on him," she added with a half-serious, half-teasing smirk. Grace mustered a tiny laugh. "Believe me, I intend to be a picture of perfection." Inside, her stomach was doing anxious flips. She knew Molly was trying to lighten the mood, but the warning was warranted. Vincent Caruso wasn't some regular VIP. He was potentially dangerous. A few minutes later, Grace returned to the private table with a tray of drinks balanced on her palm. She could feel the guarded eyes of Caruso's men following her every move. As she carefully set each glass in front of the gentlemen according to their orders, the conversation at the table hushed. The men had been speaking in low, indistinct tones, but they fell silent as she approached, presumably not wanting an outsider to overhear any sensitive talk. Grace's senses pricked with curiosity despite herself. What sort of business did powerful criminals discuss over dinner? She pushed the thought away. Eavesdropping on Vincent Caruso was the last thing she should do if she valued her job. And possibly her kneecaps. She placed the 2 whiskeys in front of the impatient pair who had ordered them. They barely paused their murmured side conversation to mutter thanks. The older advisor received his glass of red wine with a polite nod to her. Lastly, Grace stepped toward Caruso, who watched her steadily. She gently set the goblet of deep crimson Chianti at his right hand. "Your wine, sir," she said quietly. Caruso's eyes flicked up from the wine to meet hers. "Grazie," he said, voice soft. "Thank you," in Italian. Grace recognized the word. She had spent a year in Rome during an abortive attempt at studying abroad, and picked up some of the language. The unexpected courtesy and use of Italian surprised her. She hadn't anticipated manners from a man with such a fearsome reputation. Caught off guard, Grace offered a hesitant smile before she could think better of it. Vincent Caruso tilted his head slightly, as if something about her piqued his interest. But he said nothing more, merely turning to give a pointed look at the man to his left. Taking the cue, the underling cleared his throat and reached into his suit jacket. "We'll take the 2001 Barolo with dinner," the man said to Grace, handing her the wine list back. Clearly, that was their choice of bottle for the meal. Grace nodded and promised to return shortly to take their food order after they'd had a chance to review the menus. Escaping once more to the periphery of the dining room, Grace allowed herself a slow exhale. So far, so good. She hadn't dropped anything or offended anyone. Caruso and his men were settling in, and with any luck they would dine and depart without incident. If only her nerves would settle. Grace peeked over now and then as she went about tending to her other tables. The Caruso party seemed to be engaged in quiet discussion while sipping their drinks. She noticed Vincent Caruso rarely spoke, mostly listening with an unreadable expression as his men murmured updates or opinions. From the snatches of conversation she caught while passing by, it sounded like they were discussing various business ventures, clubs, construction projects, shipments. Normal topics for rich businessmen, perhaps, though Grace suspected these had criminal undertones. As Grace waited for the sommelier to fetch the requested Barolo from the cellar, she busied herself by straightening clean napkins and polishing cutlery at the service stand. Her mind wandered to more mundane worries. The stack of bills awaiting her at home, her upcoming weekend class at the community college, the fact that her worn-out sneakers would need replacing soon. She had recently re-enrolled in night courses to finish her degree in finance, scraping together tuition with tips from Giovanni's. It was exhausting, balancing coursework after late restaurant shifts, but Grace refused to give up on her dream of entering the financial world in a legitimate way someday. If I can just get through a few more semesters, she thought to herself, wiping a spotless fork for the third time. The money from this job was the linchpin of her plans. Finally, the sommelier returned with the expensive Barolo. Grace delivered the bottle to the table and poured a taste for Caruso's advisor to sample. He swirled and approved, and she deftly filled each glass. Next, she took their dinner orders, a process thankfully free of any drama. Vincent Caruso chose the ossobuco special, meeting her gaze as he ordered in what almost felt like a challenge, though she couldn't guess why. Grace just nodded respectfully and collected their menus. Once the men fell back into conversation, Grace retreated and relayed the order to the kitchen. Everything was proceeding smoothly. With the meals underway, she checked on her other tables and refilled a few drinks across the room. Perhaps her fears had been unfounded. Maybe this would be an ordinary night after all, despite the notorious company in the corner. She was just returning from dropping off a tray of appetizers at a nearby table when she overheard a raised voice from the direction of Caruso's booth. Losing money hand over fist. At this rate, we'll be in the red this quarter, someone was saying tensely. Grace slowed her steps instinctively, her ears catching the frustration in the tone. It sounded like one of Caruso's men. I told you, the numbers from the Starford deal don't add up, another man muttered. We might need to cut our losses, boss. Grace tried to mind her own business, but it was impossible not to hear the annoyance spilling from their hushed private discussion. She kept her back partially turned, pretending to be absorbed in adjusting the angle of a nearby table's candle. A deeper voice, laced with impatience, cut through the others. Caruso himself. Every time we invest in something legitimate, it's the same song and dance, he said coldly. I hire so-called experts to handle finances, and still I'm hearing excuses. Perhaps I should just burn my money in a barrel. At least it'd save time. There was a low, uneasy chuckle from one of the men, as if unsure whether to laugh. Grace's lips pressed together. She could practically feel the tension radiating from their table now. Another man spoke up, trying to sound confident. Boss, if we just raise the cover charges at the clubs and maybe cut some staff, we can make up the shortfall. Vincent Caruso made a dismissive noise. Bleed the customers and squeeze our own people dry? That's your brilliant solution, Bruno? He said, voice dripping with sarcasm. The one called Bruno fell silent. Clearly that suggestion had not pleased Caruso. Grace realized she was loitering dangerously close. She should move away, but in that moment, Vincent Caruso's gaze flickered up and landed directly on her. She was still half turned away with her hand on the back of an empty chair. Their eyes met. His sharp and assessing, hers wide with alarm at being caught lingering. Miss, Caruso called out to her suddenly, his voice cutting across the low murmurs. Grace nearly jumped. Her mind raced. Had he noticed her eavesdropping? Was he about to have her fired for prying? Slowly, she turned fully to face the table, clutching her tray to her chest. Yes, sir? Did you need something? Grace asked cautiously. Vincent Caruso's expression was unreadable, that slight half-smile ghosting over his lips again. His men were all looking at her now, some with curiosity, others with annoyance at the interruption. Bruno in particular, the burly man who had suggested raising prices, was eyeing Grace with a frown. Caruso tapped a finger against the stem of his wineglass. Forgive me for pulling you into this, he said, but we seem to be having a little debate over here. He gestured vaguely at his companions. Tell me, Grace, and was it? What do you think a business should do if it's losing money? For a second, Grace was sure she hadn't heard him right. Had the city's most feared Mafia boss really just asked her, a random waitress, for business advice? and in such a casual tone, as if genuinely seeking her opinion. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. This had to be some kind of test, or a trap. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to laugh it off, to say, "I wouldn't know, sir," and back away as quickly as possible. But in Vincent Caruso's expectant gaze, she sensed a challenge, and perhaps genuine curiosity. The other men at the table were staring at her, one or two with barely hidden smirks, anticipating her embarrassment. Grace flushed. They clearly expected her to stutter or say something foolish. She could feel Molly's eyes on her from across the room and remembered her friend's advice. Don't mess up. This was definitely not what Molly had meant, but the thought steeled Grace's spine. If she humiliated herself now, she might not only lose her job. Who knew how a man like Caruso would react? Perhaps honesty and straightforwardness would serve her better than cowering. Grace wetted her dry lips. Well, she began carefully, her voice quiet but growing steadier as she forced herself to speak. If a business is losing money, simply squeezing more out of customers or staff might only fix things short term. It could drive people away and hurt the business in the long run. A couple of Caruso's men exchanged looks. Bruno, the one who had made that suggestion and earned Caruso's scorn, folded his arms and glared at her openly now. Grace's cheeks burned, but she continued, addressing Vincent Caruso, though she could hardly believe she was doing so. Sometimes the issue isn't that customers won't pay or that employees aren't worth their cost, she said. Sometimes money is disappearing from somewhere in the pipeline. She paused meaningfully. It could be an accounting error, or someone taking a cut before the earnings are reported. At that, the faint amusement on Caruso's face faded, replaced by a keener interest. The table had fallen utterly silent. Grace was sure she'd gone too far. Why on earth had she practically insinuated in front of Caruso and his crew that one of them might be stealing? She braced herself for an explosion of anger. The eruption came, but not from Caruso. Bruno lurched forward, one beefy hand slapping the table. "What exactly are you implying?" He growled at Grace. His ruddy face darkened with either rage or anxiety, perhaps both. "You think we can't manage our own books? That's rich, coming from a girl who balances dinner trays for a living." Bruno. Caruso's voice cut through the man's words like a blade. Cold, quiet, but undeniably commanding. Bruno immediately closed his mouth, though his glare at Grace remained. Grace's heart was in her throat. She couldn't move, pinned by a mixture of fear and the adrenaline of what she'd just dared to say. She quickly looked down at her feet, suddenly very aware of the dangerous line she had crossed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to presume," she stammered quickly. But Vincent Caruso held up a finger, silencing her apology. "No need to apologize," he said evenly, eyes still fixed on her. He leaned back in his chair, considering Grace with that same unreadable expression. "In fact, I believe you may be onto something." The faint clink of silverware and distant chatter of other diners were the only sounds in the stunned silence that followed. Grace stared at Vincent Caruso, unsure she'd heard him correctly. He thought she was onto something? Was that agreement in his tone? Caruso turned his head slowly to sweep his gaze over his men. "Tomorrow morning, I want a full audit of the Starford accounts," he stated, voice deceptively calm. The directive was clearly aimed at the entire table, though Bruno in particular visibly tensed. "Every invoice, every expense. If there's a leak, we'll find it." Grace remained rooted to the spot, scarcely daring to breathe. Her mind raced to process that her bold suggestion hadn't gotten her killed or fired, but was actually being taken seriously by this dangerous man. Vincent Caruso's attention returned to Grace. The slightest hint of a genuine smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. "Ms. Delaney, it seems I owe you thanks," he said, inclining his head graciously. Grace was sure every person within earshot, including herself, nearly fell over in shock. Mafia bosses did not just thank random waitresses. I was only answering your question," Grace managed, voice faltering. Her face felt hot. "I hope I didn't overstep." Caruso waved a hand dismissively. "On the contrary, honest answers are hard to come by these days." His steel-gray eyes glinted with something like approval. "You have a good head on your shoulders." Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. A few seats away, Bruno looked positively sour but said nothing. The others observed the exchange with interest and perhaps a touch of amusement. Then came the moment that truly left Grace lightheaded. Vincent Caruso leaned forward and addressed her directly in that low, commanding tone. "Tell me, Grace," he asked, "where did you learn about business and finance? You speak like someone with some expertise." Grace blinked. Was he actually asking about her background now, in front of his whole crew? She swallowed. I take night classes at City College," she said quietly. "I was studying finance at a university before but had to drop out. Now I'm finishing my degree part-time." She added hastily, "I'm not an expert or anything. I just pick up on some things." Caruso arched an eyebrow, interest evident. "Is that so?" It wasn't phrased as a question. He regarded her thoughtfully for a moment, fingertips pressed together. "A waitress who knows how to spot a balance sheet problem. Life is full of surprises." Grace's heart thumped. She gripped the edges of her tray to keep her hands from shaking. Was it her imagination, or did Vincent Caruso almost sound impressed? He exchanged a glance with the older advisor beside him, who gave a slight nod as if confirming something unspoken. Then Caruso's focus returned to Grace, and he said the words that would replay in her head for days. "Perhaps I could use someone with your instincts. How would you like to put that finance knowledge to use? Working for me?" Grace's jaw nearly dropped. A collective blink went around the table. Bruno coughed as if he couldn't believe his ears. One of the other men failed to hide a grin of surprise behind his hand. "Work for you?" Grace echoed dumbly. She was certain she must have misheard this time. "Her? Work for a mob boss?" Vincent Caruso actually chuckled, a low sound that made it unclear whether he was joking or not. "I'm in need of people I can trust. People with brains," he said. "It sounds like you might qualify on both counts." Grace felt her face go through a whole cycle of expressions: astonishment, disbelief, confusion. This had to be some kind of strange test or humor at her expense. She could hardly form a response. I don't," she stuttered, glancing around. Every man at the table was watching her intently now, and she realized she had to say something. "That's a very generous offer, Mr. Caruso," she managed carefully. "But I'm just a waitress, yes, I know." Caruso finished for her, still with that slight smile. "But clearly more than that, Grace opened her mouth, still utterly at a loss. Her tongue felt tied in knots. Was he serious? His expression looked calm and sincere, but who could tell? Her heart drummed wildly. Work for a Mafia boss? Doing what, exactly? Handling blood-soaked money? That didn't exactly line up with her career goals in finance. And yet, part of her felt an undeniable thrill at the audacity of his suggestion. She realized Vincent Caruso was patiently awaiting her answer. So were all his men. Her gaze flickered to Bruno, who still looked like he'd bitten into a lemon. Intuition told Grace that accepting too eagerly might paint a target on her back with certain folks at this table. And truthfully, she had no idea what such work would even entail. "Maybe," she said weakly, "maybe we could talk about it later?" Caruso inclined his head, understanding the weight of her hesitation in this public setting. "Of course. Another time, then," he agreed smoothly. "Think it over." He reached inside his suit jacket. Grace tensed for a split second, but he simply pulled out a small black card holder. From it, he withdrew a business card and held it between two fingers. Grace gingerly stepped forward to take it, hoping no one noticed the tremble in her hand as she did. The card was thick, ivory-colored with embossed lettering. It displayed only a name, Vincent Caruso, and a phone number in elegant type. "No title, no company, and none needed. Our number is on there," Caruso said. Grace noted the subtle use of our, implying the number would reach his office or his assistant, perhaps. "When you decide you're ready to talk, call. I'd hate to see talent go to waste." His eyes bore into her, making clear that his offer was genuine. Thank you," Grace murmured. She slid the card carefully into the pocket of her apron, her mind still reeling. "Good." Caruso nodded once, then casually lifted his hand in a small gesture of dismissal. "That will be all for now, Grace." The sudden return to formality was almost jarring. Grace remembered abruptly that she was at work, and she'd been standing here entangled in conversation far longer than was appropriate. Heat rushed to her cheeks. "Oh, of course, sir. Enjoy your meal," she stammered. She retreated a few steps, her legs feeling like rubber, then turned and hurried off toward the kitchen, needing a moment away from those penetrating stares. Only when she was safely in the bustling kitchen corridor did Grace let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 10 minutes. She leaned back against the wall beside a rack of clean plates, pressing a hand to her forehead. Did all of that just happen? Molly poked her head around the corner, eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Oh my God, Grace," she hissed. "I caught bits and pieces. Did he actually offer you a job, or did I imagine that?" Grace let out a shaky laugh. "I think he did. I'm not entirely sure myself." Molly's jaw dropped, then she grinned. "Girl, only you could turn waiting tables into a corporate recruitment by the mob." "Don't joke," Grace pleaded, though a disbelieving laugh bubbled out of her as well. Now that she was out of the spotlight, a sort of giddiness and relief washed over her. She hadn't embarrassed herself. In fact, she seemed to have impressed Vincent Caruso, and survived doing so. "I mean it, be careful," Molly said more seriously, gently touching Grace's arm. "This is probably not a normal job offer. Well, you know who he is." Grace nodded, sobering. "I know. Trust me, I know." She absently fingered the edge of the business card in her apron pocket. Part of her was inclined to toss it out and pretend this conversation never occurred. What business did she have even considering stepping one foot into that world? She'd worked hard to keep her life honest and her nose clean despite hardships. Yet another part of her, a small voice in the back of her mind, whispered that this might be a once-in-a-lifetime chance. A door unexpectedly cracked open. What lay behind it was uncertain. Opportunity, danger, or both. For now, she had to get through the rest of her shift. Smoothing her hair and straightening her apron, Grace forced her racing thoughts aside. The kitchen had prepared the Caruso table's appetizers, and she needed to deliver them. When Grace emerged again into the dining area balancing a tray of antipasti, she found the tension at Vincent Caruso's table noticeably diffused. The men had resumed their low conversations, though Bruno sat stony-faced and silent. Caruso himself was chatting quietly with the older advisor, swirling his wine occasionally and appearing utterly at ease once more. As Grace served their dishes, bruschetta, a platter of fine cheeses and cured meats, the men thanked her curtly or with polite nods. Vincent Caruso caught her eye as she set down a plate of imported olives near him. "Thank you, Grace," he said softly, his tone cordial. If one didn't know better, it would seem like he was just another gracious patron, and she a favored waitress. "You're welcome, sir," Grace replied, lowering her gaze demurely. Her pulse quickened when he continued to watch her for a second longer than necessary. There was an undeniable spark of curiosity and regard in his eyes that hadn't been there at the start of the evening. Grace withdrew again, and the night moved on. She stayed busy with her duties, refilling drinks, bringing out entrees when they were ready, and doing her best to remain professional. Inside, though, her mind churned on the surreal exchange that had taken place. Each time she dared glance at the corner table, she found Caruso focused on his companions or on his meal, but a few times she caught one of his men, especially Bruno, throwing a dark look her way. She kept her distance and decided it was best to not approach unless summoned. Eventually, dessert and coffee were offered, but Caruso declined. It seemed they were wrapping up. Grace helped clear away their plates. The Mafia boss's party prepared to depart into the late evening, shrugging on coats and settling the bill discreetly with the manager at the table. Giovanni's had a policy of handling checks at the table for privacy, especially with high-profile clients. Grace hung back politely while her manager, Mr. Bianchi, personally attended to Vincent Caruso, who signed the receipt with a flourish. Caruso then stood, pushing in his chair. His men rose as well. Grace stepped forward, knowing it was part of her job to thank them for dining and bid them good night. Despite everything that had happened, habit took over. "Thank you very much for joining us this evening," she said, hoping her voice sounded steady. "Have a wonderful night." Her eyes flickered to Caruso as she spoke. Vincent Caruso shrugged on a long dark overcoat that one of his bodyguards held for him. Once he was settled in it, he turned to Grace. To her surprise, he extended his hand, not in a handshake exactly, but as if about to perform a genteel gesture. Unsure, Grace lifted her own hand. He took it lightly, his large palm warm, and fingers paradoxically gentle as they closed over hers. "The pleasure was ours," Caruso said, looking at her with that penetrating gaze. "I hope to see you again, Grace." Grace's breath caught for an instant. There was weight in those words beyond a simple pleasantry. "Likewise, Mr. Caruso," she managed softly. His lips curved in that faint smile one last time. Then he released her hand and nodded to his men. With that, Vincent Caruso strode out of Giovanni's, his entourage following in tight formation. The door swung shut behind them, and the ambient noise of the restaurant swelled back to normal, as if the air pressure had changed now that he was gone. It was only once the group's black cars outside had pulled away from the curb that the staff of Giovanni's collectively exhaled and began buzzing. Several waiters rushed up to Grace. "What did he say to you? Did he really offer you a job? Are you okay?" The questions flew, half excited and half concerned. Grace answered as best as she could. "Yes, apparently he did ask me to work for him, and no, I'm not sure what I'll do. Yes, I'm fine, just shocked." Mr. Bianchi approached, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. The manager looked simultaneously relieved and exhausted. "Miss Delaney," he said in a low tone, pulling her slightly aside from the babbling co-workers. "Mr. Caruso left something for you." Grace's heart skipped. "Left something?" Bianchi held out an envelope, a thick, cream-colored one like those used for greeting cards. Her name was scrawled across the front in an elegant penmanship. She recognized the handwriting at once. It must be Vincent Caruso's. Hands suddenly clammy, Grace accepted the envelope and peeked inside. Her eyes widened. There was a stack of crisp bills, $100 notes, from the glimpse of Benjamin Franklin's face on the top bill. Alongside the cash was a short note on Giovanni's stationery. "Thank you for your invaluable insight. V." Grace looked back at her manager, mouth open in protest. This was too much. I can't accept." Mr. Bianchi held up a hand. "It's yours. Believe me, you don't want to refuse a gift from Mr. Caruso," he said with a knowing, wary smile. "Consider it a very generous tip, in cash. Off the books." Grace swallowed and nodded slowly. She couldn't begin to count it now in front of everyone, but from the thickness she guessed it had to be thousands of dollars. Never in her life had she received a tip of this magnitude. It felt like a lead weight in her hands, a blessing and a burden. Afterward, as the excitement died down, Grace finished her closing duties in a distracted haze. She stored the envelope carefully in her bag, already planning to lock it in her apartment safe box as soon as she got home. She changed out of her uniform and clocked out, saying goodbye to Molly and her colleagues, while deflecting their playful insistence that she treat them all after landing such a windfall. The night air had a chill as Grace stepped outside the restaurant into the nearly empty street. It was past midnight, and her feet ached from hours on the floor. But she barely felt the pain. She stood for a moment under a street lamp, breath visible in the cold, letting reality wash over her. An ordinary work shift had turned into something extraordinary. She had met Vincent Caruso, and somehow impressed him enough that he'd offered her a job, or something like it, and pressed a small fortune into her hands as a tip. Grace's thoughts were a whirlwind on the taxi ride back to her tiny apartment across town. By the time she tumbled into bed, she still hadn't fully processed what to do about any of it. The business card sat on her bedside table, seeming to taunt her with possibilities. Exhaustion eventually overtook her racing mind. But as she drifted to sleep in the early hours of morning, one thought repeated itself over and over. Her life might have just changed, and there might be no going back to the way things were. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Grace's small apartment the next morning, waking her far too early after the tumultuous night. She groaned softly and rolled over, but almost immediately her eyes snapped open as memories flooded back. It hadn't been a dream. The restaurant, Vincent Caruso, the outrageous job offer, the envelope of cash sitting in her bag across the room. All of it was real. Grace sat up and rubbed her face. "What now?" she whispered to herself. Her first impulse was to treat it like any other morning. Brew a cup of coffee, get ready for the day, maybe review her notes for her Saturday finance class. But normal routine seemed impossible. She padded over to her cluttered desk where she'd tossed her purse the night before. With a deep breath, she pulled out the sealed envelope. Sitting cross-legged on her bed, Grace carefully counted the money inside. $10,000! She let out a low whistle. It was more cash than she'd ever held in her life. It could pay 3 months of rent, her next semester's tuition, and still leave plenty for daily expenses. It was also undeniably Mafia money, a thought that made her uneasy. Grace set the bills aside and unfolded the little note Vincent had written. "Thank you for your invaluable insight." She read again under her breath. The initial V was penned in a bold, confident stroke. She traced it with her fingertip, biting her lip. Why did that single letter send a small thrill through her? She shook her head, trying to ground herself. After a quick shower and a much-needed coffee, Grace sat at her laptop. Maybe burying herself in something familiar, like finances, would help her think clearly. On a whim, she logged into her college's student portal to check her tuition balance, which was due next week. It was one of the many worries swirling in her mind lately. The screen loaded, and Grace nearly spat out her coffee. The balance due, numeral. As of this morning, her tuition was marked paid in full for the semester. A notation read, "Payment received. Thank you." Her heart skipped a beat. There was no mistaking it. Someone had paid her tuition overnight. No, not someone. She could guess exactly who. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, equal parts grateful and alarmed. Vincent Caruso must have had his people find out her school and student account. Maybe when she mentioned taking night classes, he'd taken it upon himself to... She stood abruptly, pacing her small living area. This was not a casual gesture. Paying thousands of dollars of her tuition without even asking, it was overwhelming. Generous, yes, and it would lift a huge burden off her shoulders. But it also meant he was serious about courting her skills. And perhaps he was making sure she had reasons to say yes. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, startling her. Grace lunged and snatched it up, half expecting to see an unknown number that could be Caruso's. But it was her friend Molly. She answered, and immediately Molly's excited chatter came through. "Gracie, did you survive? What's going on? Spill everything. Have you called him yet?" Grace managed a wry smile. Molly never wasted time. "Good morning to you too," she said. "I just woke up. You know I couldn't sleep last night wondering if you'd actually consider working for a mob boss." Molly's tone mixed concern and disbelief. "It's insane, right? You're not really going to, are you?" Grace sank back onto her bed, sighing. "Malls, I don't know. Probably not. I mean, it's crazy. I can't just dive into that world." "Exactly," Molly said firmly. "I mean, sure, the money could be amazing, and he's very handsome in a dangerous sort of way." "Molly," Grace protested, though her cheeks warmed because she couldn't deny that observation. "What? I'm just saying. He's trouble wrapped in a tux, babe. Don't get seduced by that." Her friend's voice softened. "I care about you. I don't want you hurt or caught up in something illegal." Grace closed her eyes. "I know. You're right." She paused, then admitted quietly, "He already paid my entire tuition, Molly." There was dead silence on the line for a moment. "He what?" "Yeah, I just checked and it's zeroed out. He must have done it after leaving the restaurant." Grace ran a hand through her damp hair. "I haven't even spoken to him since last night and he's already... involved?" Molly let out a low whistle akin to what Grace had done earlier. "That's wow. I mean, that's kind of sweet but also kind of terrifying. Like marking his territory or something? It feels like pressure," Grace murmured. "How can I accept that and then not at least talk to him about this job?" "Maybe you can pay it back if you decide not to get involved," Molly offered. "He gave you tip money too, right? But then you probably can't match whatever he just paid." Grace eyed the stack of cash on her bed. "He paid more than what he tipped me, I'm guessing. My tuition was no small chunk of change." Molly sighed. "Be careful, okay? If you do call him, and it sounds like you will, just promise you'll keep your guard up. Don't agree to anything on the spot, and you can always back out if it's too much." "Promise," Grace said. "I'm just going to feel him out, that's all." After hanging up, Grace found herself holding Vincent Caruso's card, running her thumb along the embossed letters. She took a steadying breath and dialed the number. It rang only once before a crisp male voice answered, "Mr. Caruso's office." Grace hadn't expected a secretary or assistant. For some reason, she thought he'd given her a direct line. "Oh, hello. This is Grace Delaney. Mr. Caruso asked me to call. There was a brief pause. Then the man responded with professional warmth. Ah, Miss Delaney. Yes, Mr. Caruso is expecting your call. One moment, please. Expecting it? Grace's heart thumped as she heard a click and a line transfer. Almost immediately, Vincent Caruso's voice came through, rich and smooth over the phone. Grace, he said, and just her name sounded different in his mouth. Intimate somehow, even over the phone. I'm glad you called. Grace found herself smiling nervously. Good morning, Mr. Caruso. A low chuckle. It's Vincent, please. After last night, I think first names are appropriate, don't you? She flushed, remembering how he'd held her hand when departing. Oh, okay. Vincent. It felt very personal to address him so, but she continued. I wanted to thank you. For everything. The tip you left and... She hesitated, deciding whether to bring up the tuition directly. And the tuition payment, he finished for her matter-of-factly. So he didn't intend it as a secret. It's the least I could do, Grace. Consider it an investment. In your education, in our potential working relationship. Grace's voice caught. It's incredibly generous, but I can't help feeling like I owe you now. Vincent's voice softened. All you owe me is a conversation. Nothing more unless you choose. I won't pretend I didn't hope to earn your goodwill by helping with something important to you. I did my homework and discovered financial strain was holding you back from finishing school. That was something easily fixed. Easily. Grace was momentarily speechless. For him, perhaps covering thousands of dollars was trivial. For her, it was life-changing. She wasn't sure how to feel about being homework to him, but he spoke without malice, almost like he genuinely cared about her goals. You must have a lot of resources to find that out overnight, she said quietly. A few, Vincent replied, a hint of dry humor in his tone. I apologize if it feels intrusive. I merely wanted to remove one worry from your mind. Grace's fingers tightened on the phone. Thank you, she said sincerely. It was a big worry. I don't want to take advantage. You're not, Vincent interjected firmly. If anything, I am the one seeking to take advantage of your talents. Grace's breath caught. When he put it that way, it made her feel oddly valued, not exploited. You mentioned wanting to talk, she said, steering back to practical matters. About that. Job. Yes. His voice shifted into a businesslike cadence. If you're willing, I'd like to discuss some details in person. Perhaps over lunch today? I can send a car for you, or if you prefer, we can meet somewhere public. Lunch, Grace echoed, nerves fluttering in her stomach. Meeting him in daylight, one-on-one, she realized she wanted to, if only to see where this might go, and to thank him face to face. All right. Where should I come? I'll have my driver pick you up, say at noon, he offered. I promise I'm not spiriting you away. We can meet at my office or any location you choose. Grace chewed her lip. The idea of being picked up felt like ceding control, but she also had never been to his office and wouldn't know where to go. Your office is fine. Very good, Vincent said pleasantly. Please text the address where you'd like Tony, my driver, to meet you. I look forward to seeing you, Grace. Me too, she said softly, surprised to find she truly meant it. After hanging up, Grace realized her palms were slightly damp. She was really going to meet Vincent Caruso, not as a waitress serving him dinner, but as... What, a prospective employee? A consultant? Something more? She chose her outfit carefully as noon approached, wanting to look professional, but not overly formal. In the end, she settled on a simple knee-length navy dress and a light gray blazer with low heels. She hoped she looked more finance graduate than restaurant server. True to his word, a sleek black town car rolled up outside her apartment building just before 12 Saint. Grace had given an address a block away rather than right at her door, out of an abundance of caution. The uniformed driver stepped out and opened the rear door for her. Miss Delaney? Yes, Grace said, clutching her purse. You must be Tony. That's right, he said with a polite smile. Tony was a stout, middle-aged man with a kindly face. Not quite what she expected for a Mafia driver, though the bulge of a shoulder holster under his jacket didn't escape her notice. Mr. Caruso asked me to take you to him. Please watch your step. She slid into the plush leather back seat. The door closed and off they went, gliding through the city. Grace tried to steady her breathing. This was just a meeting, just a discussion. She recalled Molly's words and steeled herself to keep boundaries, to not get swept away by Vincent's charisma or generosity alone. The car eventually pulled up in front of a modern high-rise tower in Midtown. Tony escorted her through the lobby to a private elevator, using a security key to access the top floors. Clearly, Vincent Caruso valued privacy. When the elevator doors opened, Grace stepped directly into an expansive office suite, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Manhattan's skyline. The space was luxurious yet tasteful, dark wood accents, a large abstract painting on one wall, and a massive glass desk at one end. A few men in suits stood discreetly near the edges of the room, likely security or staff. And there, looking out at the view with hands in his pockets, stood Vincent. He turned as she approached, and Grace had to remind herself to breathe. In the daylight, he was no less striking. He'd removed his jacket and tie, the top buttons of his dress shirt undone in a casual elegance. A faint smile lit his features as she entered. "Grace, welcome," Vincent said, striding forward. For a heartbeat, she thought he might greet her with a kiss on the cheek. An absurd notion. But he simply motioned to a seating area with a sofa and chairs near the windows. "I'm glad you came." "I almost didn't," she admitted lightly, trying to dispel her nerves with honesty. "But I figured I owe you at least a conversation." He chuckled. "Fair enough." He gestured to the sofa and she sat. Vincent took the armchair adjacent. Not too close, but near enough that his attention felt immediate and focused. He nodded to one of the hovering men. "Angelo, could you bring the documents and then give us the room?" The older gentleman, Grace realized it was the same silver-haired advisor from the restaurant, brought over a slim folder and placed it on the coffee table. He gave Grace a polite smile in passing, then quietly ushered the other staff out of the office, closing the heavy double doors behind them. They were alone, or at least, as alone as one could be in a building likely brimming with Caruso's security at every exit. Vincent leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I won't beat around the bush. After our discussion last night, I had my team do an in-depth review of the finances for the Starford project, the investment that was, as you heard, hemorrhaging money." He tapped the folder Angelo had left. "The findings were illuminating." Grace folded her hands in her lap to stop from fiddling anxiously. "Oh?" Vincent's jaw tightened a fraction. "It appears you were correct to suspect a leak. Over the past 6 months, numerous expenses were falsified or inflated. Money was being siphoned off systematically." He flipped open the folder to show a printout of figures and transaction listings. Grace leaned closer, scanning the columns of numbers. Even at a glance, she could see patterns. Certain vendor names repeating with large payments, inconsistent cost reports. "How much was taken?" she asked softly. "A little over $2 million. Vincent's voice was controlled, but she could sense the anger simmering beneath. "Which, while not a devastating sum to my organization, is irritating." Grace blew out a breath. "That's a lot of money to vanish under everyone's noses." Vincent gave a humorless smile. "Indeed. My accountants should have flagged it sooner. I'll be having discussions with them as well." He paused, then said in a lower tone, "And with Bruno." Grace's stomach clenched. Of course. Bruno had essentially been in charge of that project's oversight. So it was him? Vincent drummed his fingers once on the folder. "All signs point to Bruno funneling funds to a shell company he controlled. He hasn't been formally confronted yet. I wanted confirmation before I proceeded." He looked at her meaningfully. "Thanks to you, I have it." Grace didn't quite know how to respond. She felt a rush of satisfaction that her hunch had been right, tempered by anxiety over what that meant for Bruno. And for her. Bruno's hostility the night before had been palpable. If he truly was guilty, he must have realized he was under suspicion after she spoke up. Vincent seemed to read her mind. "I've taken steps to ensure Bruno can't run. He believes we're having a routine meeting later today. He doesn't know we're aware of his theft yet." Grace nodded, her heart rate picking up. This was Mafia business now, likely a far more dangerous confrontation than a mere firing. What will you do to him?" she asked quietly, not sure she wanted the details. Vincent studied her face for a moment. "That's something I'll handle. You don't need to worry about it, which was a polite way of not telling her. Grace decided not to press. Part of her didn't want to know how Vincent Caruso dispensed with traitors. He closed the folder and sat back a little, eyes still on her. Now, as for you, Grace. She straightened almost reflexively under that intense gaze. Yes? I meant what I said. I could use someone like you. He tented his fingers thoughtfully. You have an intuitive grasp of finances and you're clearly intelligent. More importantly, you were brave enough to speak the truth in a room full of men who might have preferred you stayed quiet. That tells me you have a good deal of courage. Grace felt a flush of pride at his praise, but she also remembered how frightened she'd been. I almost didn't say anything, she admitted. I was terrified, to be honest. That's normal, Vincent replied, giving a small shrug. Fear keeps us alert, but you acted despite it. You'd be surprised how rare that is. For a moment, a shadow crossed his expression, as if experience had taught him disappointment in others' cowardice or dishonesty. He continued, I won't lie to you. Working for me, even in a legitimate capacity, can be complicated. My world intersects with both the legal and illegal. If you have moral objections or simply fear the danger, I'd understand if you refuse. Grace appreciated that candor. She looked down at her hands. It's not that I want to be involved in anything illegal, she said carefully. I want to finish my degree and have a normal career. But I feel like I owe you for helping me, and I can't deny I'm curious. It's an opportunity to use what I know in a unique way. Vincent's lips curved as she spoke, as if her honest reasoning pleased him. I assure you, I wouldn't ask you to do anything violent or illicit. Think of it as being a financial consultant. You spot problems, suggest solutions, perhaps help oversee some business strategies. Some of my businesses are perfectly above board. Restaurants, real estate, shipping. They need managing just like any other. Grace considered. That didn't sound so bad on the surface. In fact, it sounded thrilling to have influence in major dealings at her age. The catch, of course, was the nature of the man sitting in front of her and the potential that not all operations were clean. There's also the matter of trust, she said softly, meeting his eyes. You barely know me. How can you trust me with sensitive information? Vincent inclined his head. Fair question. I make it my business to know people I consider bringing close. He gave a faint smile. I took the liberty of looking into your background. Grace, everything I found confirmed that you're exactly who you seem. A hardworking, principled young woman trying to build a better life for herself and her family. Grace felt a slight chill at how easily he could have dug into her life. Family, she echoed. I only have my mom these days. My dad passed a few years ago. Vincent nodded, eyes gentle. My condolences. I read that he owned a small auto shop. He did, Grace said, surprised. She hadn't mentioned that to anyone at Giovanni's. He really had done research. He poured everything into it. When he died, we had to sell it and cover a lot of debt. She swallowed. That's partly why I dropped out of school that first time. I needed to help Mom. I understand, Vincent said softly, and from the look in his eyes, she believed he did. Loyalty and family mean everything to some of us. A brief silence fell. Grace felt unexpectedly moved that he'd bothered to learn about her struggles. It made her feel seen. She cleared her throat lightly. So if I were to work for you, what would you expect of me? And what about finishing my degree? Vincent spread his hands in a placating gesture. I wouldn't want to stand in the way of your education. We could arrange flexible hours around your classes, or even cover the cost for you to accelerate your studies if you want. He smiled wryly. I might be many things, but I'm not against higher learning. That earned a tiny laugh from Grace. She appreciated the answer. And in terms of work? He grew a bit more serious. Initially, I'd want your help reviewing accounts and investments, much like what you indirectly did last night. Looking for inefficiencies, identifying potential problems. Think of it as auditing with fresh eyes. His tone darkened a touch. Clearly, some of my current people haven't been as vigilant as they should. Grace nodded slowly. That didn't sound too scary. Poring over ledgers, analyzing budgets. In fact, it sounded right up her alley. Beyond that, he continued, I might ask your insight on new ventures, legitimate ones, I've been expanding into more above-board businesses in recent years. It never hurts to have an honest perspective uninfluenced by old habits of our world. She read between the lines. He valued that she wasn't a career criminal, that she might spot risks or opportunities his inner circle wouldn't. It dawned on Grace that Vincent Caruso might genuinely be looking to steer some of his empire toward legitimacy, perhaps for stability or image, and he saw her as an asset in that direction. "This almost sounds too good to be true," Grace said, one eyebrow arched. "What's the catch, Vincent? People don't just pluck strangers from restaurants to become quasi-financial advisors overnight." Vincent's eyes glinted. "The catch is, you'd be stepping into my world. Once you do, life changes. You might see or hear things that are difficult. It can put a target on your back, as we're already seeing with Bruno's displeasure." He sighed. "I won't sugarcoat it, Grace. If you align yourself with me, some doors in normal life may close. You can't exactly go work for a bank afterward with consultant to Vincent Caruso on your resume." She appreciated the frankness. It was true. Being affiliated with a known mob figure could stain her reputation outside his sphere. "I understand." He leaned forward, voice earnest. "That's why this is entirely your choice. You can walk away after this meeting, and you'll never hear from me again if that's what you want. The money I gave you for tuition and as a tip, that's yours regardless. I thank you for what you did. No obligations." He spread his hands. "However, if you do choose to step in, I take care of my own. You'll have resources, protection, and a place in something bigger, and I dare say we could accomplish quite a lot together." Grace's heart was pounding by the end of his little speech. The weight of the decision pressed on her. On one hand, returning to her simple life sounded almost impossible now that she'd glimpsed behind the curtain. On the other, accepting meant aligning with a man who, for all his courtesy and charm, was dangerous, and possibly dragging her into dangerous situations. "I'm worried about Bruno," she admitted after a moment. It was easier to focus on that immediate concern than the abstract future. "Last night he looked like he wanted to strangle me for even speaking up." Vincent's expression cooled. "Bruno will be handled. I won't let him or anyone else harm you. That I promise." His voice had a steely edge of finality that sent a slight shiver through her, not at fear of him, but of what he might do on her behalf. Grace realized that in truth, she had made up her mind. Perhaps it had been made up the moment she confronted him in the restaurant, or when she found her tuition paid, or when he walked toward her just now with that warm glimmer in his eyes. A part of her wanted to see this through, for better or for worse. She drew in a breath. "All right, Vincent, I'll help you." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his features with a subtle light. "I'm very pleased to hear that, Grace." The way he said her name felt like a caress. She felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with nerves now. "On a trial basis," she added quickly, for her own conscience. "We'll see how it goes. And I stay in school." "Of course," he nodded. On a trial basis. It was clear to both of them that he was confident she'd stay once she started, but she appreciated that he didn't push any harder. "Should we shake on it?" Grace offered, half in jest, half uncertain of the protocol for striking a bargain with a mob boss. Vincent chuckled. "If you like." He extended his hand to her. She reached out to clasp it. His hand engulfed hers, warm and steady. They shook once, but he didn't release her immediately. Instead, Vincent turned her hand palm up between his, studying it for a beat. Grace's breath snagged as he brushed the pad of his thumb lightly over a faint old scar on her wrist. A relic from childhood, barely noticeable. "You have my word, Grace. You'll be safe with me," he said, quietly intense as he looked into her eyes. "I take care of those under my protection." Something about the way he said it, so earnestly, made her chest tighten. She had a feeling that being under Vincent Caruso's protection was both a blessing and a heavy mantle. "I believe you," she replied softly. Seemingly satisfied, Vincent let go of her hand, albeit gently, as if reluctant. Angelo will fill you in on some of the current figures we're looking at, he said, businesslike once more. We can start right away, or if you have other commitments today. Before he could finish, a knock came at the door, and Angelo poked his head in, looking a tad flustered. Pardon, boss. We've got a situation. Vincent stood immediately, all traces of the relaxed conversationalist gone. He was back to the vigilant leader in a heartbeat. What is it? It's Bruno, Angelo said grimly. He left his place. We tried to keep tabs quietly, but he gave our guys the slip about 20 minutes ago. He's not answering his phone. The meeting this afternoon. He's running, Vincent concluded, a dangerous edge in his voice. His eyes flicked to Grace, and she saw a muscle in his jaw clench. Or planning something stupid? Grace's stomach flipped. He knows? Angelo shook his head. Not sure if he knows we uncovered everything, but he definitely suspects something. Perhaps your conversation last night spooked him more than we thought. He looked apologetic toward Grace. Vincent was already moving, shrugging on his suit jacket from where it hung over the chair. Secure the building and my schedule. We need to find him. He turned to Grace, expression apologetic but urgent. I'm sorry, Grace. I need to handle this. I understand, she said quickly, rising to her feet. He hesitated, then reached out to lightly squeeze her shoulder. I'll have Tony drive you home. Take the rest of the day. Gather anything you need to feel secure. I'd prefer if you stayed somewhere watched by my people until Bruno is dealt with. Grace's eyes widened. You think he might come after me? Vincent's face hardened. It's possible. I wouldn't put it past a desperate man. I'm going to ensure that doesn't happen. He looked to Angelo. Assign a detail to Miss Delaney immediately. She's top priority. Angelo nodded, already speaking softly into a radio. Grace's heart began to thud. This was spiraling quickly. Vincent, she began, feeling a surge of fear despite his reassurance. Vincent fixed her with a steady gaze, lowering his voice as if they were the only two people in the room. Trust me, Grace. Go home, stay alert, and let my men watch over you. I will take care of Bruno. You have my word. Something about his tone made her believe him implicitly. She gave a shaky nod. Okay. He nodded to Tony, who had appeared in the doorway, then back to Grace. I'll see you soon. And Grace, be careful. You too, she whispered. With that, she was whisked away by Tony, leaving Vincent Caruso and his men to the urgent hunt for their rogue associate. As the elevator doors closed, Grace caught one last glimpse of Vincent striding across his office, already barking orders on a phone, every inch the formidable boss once more. In the lobby, Tony guided Grace outside to the waiting car. Another man, tall and broad, subtly fell into step behind them. Miss, I'm Daniel, he introduced quietly. I'll be shadowing you for security. Grace managed a thankful smile. It was all happening so fast. Minutes ago, she had been accepting a job. Now she was under guard because someone might want her dead. Her rational mind struggled to catch up, but she forced herself to remain calm. On the ride back, Grace peered out the window, half expecting to see a tail or some sign of Bruno lurking. Nothing obvious appeared, but Daniel's vigilant eyes scanned every intersection. Tony left her with Daniel at the entrance of her apartment building. I'll be nearby if you need anything, the driver assured. Daniel followed her all the way to her apartment door on the 3rd floor, checking corners in the stairwell as they went. Though feeling a bit surreal about having a bodyguard, Grace was grateful for his presence. She offered him coffee, which he politely declined, stationing himself just outside her door in the hallway. Inside, Grace tried to occupy herself. She packed a small bag with some essentials and important documents in case she couldn't stay here for a while. Vincent had suggested she might want to relocate temporarily, perhaps to a hotel or safe house under his protection. That thought made her uneasy, but Bruno on the loose was far worse. Evening fell without news. Grace texted her mom to check in and tried to sound normal. She didn't mention anything about mob bosses or danger, of course. Just hearing her mother's relieved update that work was fine and she was making dinner made Grace yearn for simpler problems again. By nightfall, Grace was jumpy at every distant sound from the street below. Daniel remained a reassuring, solid presence outside, trading off briefly with another man around 8 p.m., which she only knew because she heard low voices and peeked through the peephole to see a new guard take position. She found herself checking her phone repeatedly, wondering if Vincent would call with an update. She hated feeling like a damsel in distress waiting in a tower, but realistically there was little she could do. Finally, around 9 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Everything's fine here. How are you holding up? V." Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The simple message brought a smile to her face. He must have been too busy to call, but he still checked on her. She replied, "I'm okay. A bit restless. No sign of trouble. Hope you're safe." Almost immediately the reply came, "Safe and sound. Bruno's being taken care of as we speak." She read that twice, unsure if "taken care of" meant what she thought. Likely. A shudder ran through her, whether of relief or apprehension, she couldn't tell. "Thank you, Vincent, truly." She tapped out. He responded with a final message. "Get some rest, Grace. I'll see you tomorrow." Tomorrow. She wondered if that meant Bruno would be out of the picture by then. Part of her felt relief, part guilt that a man's fate, even a criminal who'd threatened her, was being sealed partly due to her actions. But Bruno had made his choices, and she had to live with hers. Locking up for the night, Grace finally crawled into bed, fatigue washing over her. What a 2 days it had been. As she closed her eyes, she dared to feel a spark of optimism through the anxiety. Perhaps tomorrow this frightening chapter would close and a new one would begin with clearer skies. She hoped so. Little did Grace know, the storm had one more act left before the dawn. Grace awoke to the sound of a heavy thud against her apartment door. For a disoriented second, she thought she'd imagined it. The clock on her nightstand glowed 1:13 a.m. She sat up, heart starting to pound. Another muffled impact came, followed by a low groan. It sounded like Daniel, the guard, in pain. Fear jolted her fully awake. Something was very wrong. She scrambled out of bed and instinctively reached for her phone. Just as her fingers closed around it, the door burst open with a crash. Splintered wood flew as the chain lock gave way. Grace let out a scream, but it was cut short when 2 dark-clad figures lunged into her bedroom. She fumbled to dial Vincent's number, but a gloved hand snatched the phone from her grasp before she could hit call. "Going somewhere?" a sneering voice hissed. Grace stumbled back, only to feel a second man grab her arms from behind. She kicked and twisted desperately. "Let me go!" she cried. Panic surged. Where was her guard? She saw a third shape in the hall. The outline of Daniel slumped on the floor, unmoving. The man restraining her pinned her wrists painfully. "Feisty," he grunted. "Tape her." A roll of duct tape was produced. Grace thrashed, but the first thug forced a strip over her mouth, muffling her screams. Her hands were yanked behind her and bound tightly with more tape. Her eyes burned with helpless tears. This couldn't be happening. "Boss wants her in one piece," one man said. "Careful." Boss. That single word chilled Grace's blood. It had to be Bruno. He must have orchestrated this. Despite Vincent's precautions, Bruno had slipped through. They hauled her out of the apartment. Grace's bare feet skidded on the hallway tiles as she tried to dig her heels in. It was useless. The men were too strong. Daniel was sprawled by the door with a bleeding gash on his forehead, but she saw his chest rise. At least he was alive. She prayed he'd wake and raise an alarm, but they were already dragging her toward the stairwell. The building was quiet, most neighbors long asleep. One flight down, the men shoved her through an emergency exit to the back alley. A van idled there, side door open. Grace's muffled cries went unheard as she was lifted and thrown into the back. The door slammed, plunging her into darkness. Within seconds, the van roared off. Grace, hands bound and mouth gagged, tried to steady herself as the vehicle swayed and turned through the city streets. Her mind raced in terror. Stay calm. Think, she urged herself, fighting against a wave of despair. Vincent would realize something was wrong. But would it be too late? She thought of his promise to protect her. He didn't know she'd been taken, unless Daniel managed to call in backup. As the minutes dragged on, Grace forced herself to note details. The van made several turns, heading perhaps toward the industrial side of town. She felt the road surface change to something rougher, maybe a warehouse district with old cobblestone loading areas. The van slowed and eventually stopped. The back door yanked open, revealing the harsh glow of floodlights. One of the thugs climbed in and grabbed her by the shoulder, pulling her out. Grace blinked in the sudden brightness. They were in a large garage-like space, a warehouse interior. Stacks of crates cast long shadows. A few other armed men stood around, and there, pacing in front of an office partition with a pistol in hand, was Bruno. Grace's heart lurched with hatred and fear at the sight of his ruddy, contorted face. He looked like a man pushed past his limits, sweat beading on his brow, eyes wild. He stalked toward her as the henchman held her in place. "You!" Bruno spat, looking her up and down. The little nobody who started this whole mess. Grace glared back, though tears of anger sprang to her eyes. She tried to shout at him through the tape, but it came out as a muffled noise. Bruno sneered. "What's that?" "Can't hear you." With a cruel smirk, he nodded to one of his goons. The man stepped forward and ripped the duct tape off Grace's mouth in one swift motion. She gasped at the sting on her lips. "You won't get away with this," she said hoarsely, trying to keep her voice from trembling. Mr. Caruso will what? Save you?" Bruno cut her off, laughing sharply. "I wouldn't be so sure. By the time he figures out where you are, we'll be long gone." He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour on her face. "If he finds you at all, that is." Grace refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "He's coming for you, Bruno," she said, forcing conviction into her tone. "You're the one who should be scared." That earned a backhanded slap across her cheek that sent her reeling. Stars burst in her vision as pain blossomed. Bruno grabbed her chin roughly. "Listen, you little brat. I had a nice setup running until you stuck your nose in. Years of skimming a bit off the top, and that high and mighty Caruso never noticed. Then you, a damn waitress, come along and ruin everything in one night." He released her with a shove. Grace caught herself, breathing hard. "So it's true," she said bitterly. "You were stealing from him all along." Bruno scowled, waving his gun carelessly. "That pompous bastard never appreciated me. I built half of our operations in that sector, and he still treated me like expendable help. So what if I took a cut? I earned it," his face twisted. "But thanks to you, he had it out for me. Tried to set a trap this evening. Thought I wouldn't notice." Bruno barked another humorless laugh. "I slipped him easily. And now I've got his prize pupil as insurance." Grace's stomach churned. "You're going to use me to bargain?" Bruno shrugged. "Maybe. Caruso's predictable in some ways. He has that old-fashioned honor about women. He'll trade himself or money for you, I bet. And I'll be waiting." He nodded toward a metal support beam. "Tie her there. And gag her again. I've heard enough of her voice." Rough hands forced Grace to a pillar and looped rope around her upper body, securing her tightly to the cold steel. She winced as the cords bit into her arms over the tape binding her wrists. Another strip of tape was plastered cruelly across her mouth, silencing any further retorts. Bruno stepped back to admire their handiwork. "Comfortable?" he jeered. Grace's chest heaved with panicked breaths. She could barely move a muscle. One of Bruno's men approached. "Boss, what's the play? We really calling Caruso here? It's risky. He could bring an army." Bruno gave him a hard stare. "Of course he'll have backup. That's why we have leverage." He jerked his gun toward Grace. "We'll set terms he can't refuse. Once he's here, we use her to keep him in line, then—" "Well, accidents happen." Grace's blood ran cold. Bruno intended to kill Vincent, she had no doubt. And likely her too. once she outlived her usefulness. Bruno pulled out a phone and dialed. Grace's heart thudded. He was calling Vincent. She strained to remain calm. Perhaps this was Vincent's chance to locate them. The phone was likely untraceable, but if only she could make a noise or clue. The tape over her mouth stifled any scream. Her eyes darted around. On the ground near her feet lay a rusty screw that had fallen from the old beam. In a desperate thought, Grace began scraping the edge of her shoe against it, hoping to drag it loudly across the concrete floor. The shrill scrape of metal on concrete echoed faintly. Bruno shot her a glare and she went still, heart pounding. Hopefully the noise was enough for someone on the other end to catch. It was the only thing she could think to try. Bruno spoke into the phone, voice dripping with mock cordiality. "Vincent, good to talk to you, boss." Even from a few feet away, Grace could hear the faint, tinny sound of Vincent's voice responding sharply, though she couldn't make out words. Relief flooded her. He was on the line. Now, Bruno continued, circling near Grace as he talked. "No need for threats. I've got something of yours, and you've got something I want. Let's keep this civil for the moment, eh?" Grace closed her eyes briefly, focusing on Vincent's tone. He sounded furious, urgent. She hoped he was okay. Bruno's mention of a failed trap worried her. Bruno walked closer, and in a sudden move ripped the tape off Grace's mouth again, tearing a startled cry from her. He held the phone toward her face. "Say hello to your gallant knight, sweetheart." Grace's throat tightened. "Vincent?" she managed, her voice cracking with fear and emotion. "Grace." Vincent's voice came clearly through the speaker now. He sounded alarmed but steady. "I'm here. I'm going to get you out of this. Do you hear me?" Before she could reply, Bruno yanked the phone back. Enough," he sneered at the device. "You want her back alive, Vincent? Here are my terms. You're going to meet me alone. No men, no weapons. Bring $5 million in cash. Unmarked, small bills." He grinned, enjoying himself. "We'll do an exchange. The girl for you and the money. Then maybe I let you both live. Maybe I don't. But if I see any of your goons or suspect a trap, she's dead before you can blink." Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, despair and terror threatening to overwhelm her. Vincent's voice came hard as steel through the phone. "Bruno, if you harm her—" "You're in no position to dictate," Bruno snapped. "I'll text you the location." 15 minutes. "And Vincent, I wasn't joking about coming alone. I'll know if you bring friends." With that, he ended the call. The warehouse fell silent save for Grace's ragged breathing. Bruno's men shifted uneasily. They clearly understood how volatile the situation was. Bruno exhaled as if bracing himself. He checked the cylinder of his revolver, then nodded to his crew. "Take positions. When Caruso comes, keep out of sight but guns trained. If things go south, we finish it." He glanced at Grace bound to the pillar. "And if he tries anything funny, shoot her first." Grace's blood turned to ice. One of the thugs, a gaunt man with a snake tattoo on his neck, smirked at her as he took cover behind a crate, aiming a pistol in her direction. She squeezed her eyes shut, silently praying. "Vincent, please, be careful." The next quarter hour felt like the longest of her life. Every drip of water from the leaky roof and creak of metal echoed in the vast space. Grace's wrists burned under the tape from her futile attempts to wriggle free. She had no way to warn Vincent of the ambush lying in wait. At last, distant footsteps approached outside. The small side door to the warehouse creaked open. Vincent Caruso stepped in, alone as demanded. Grace almost sobbed in relief and fear at the sight of him. He was clad in a dark overcoat against the night chill, his expression composed but eyes blazing as they immediately locked onto her. He took in her condition, tied up, bruised cheek, tear-streaked face, and a murderous fury flickered across his features before he masked it. "All right, I'm here," Vincent called out, his voice echoing. He held up a large black duffel bag and then let it drop at his feet. "There's your money, Bruno. Let her go." Bruno emerged from behind a stack of pallets, gun leveled casually at Vincent. "Kick the bag over," he ordered. Vincent nudged the duffel forward with his foot. It slid a few yards across the concrete. Bruno gestured to one of his men, who rushed forward and snatched the bag, retreating to a safe distance to peek inside. Bundles of cash were visible. Bruno seemed momentarily surprised that Vincent had actually brought the ransom. "Very good," he said. "5 million, as asked?" "You'll find it's all there," Vincent replied evenly, hands slightly raised to show he wasn't armed. His eyes flicked to Grace again, silently asking if she was okay. She managed a tiny nod, tears threatening once more. Bruno chuckled, stepping closer to Vincent. "What an obedient boss you turned out to be. All that money and you just handed over. Must be a special girl, this one." He sneered back at Grace. Vincent's jaw tightened. "You have what you want, Bruno. Now let her go as you promised." Bruno circled slowly, and only then did Vincent show a hint of nerves, likely aware that Bruno's henchmen were hiding nearby with guns on them. "Oh, I promised I'd consider it," Bruno said airily. "But now that I think about it, tying up loose ends is safer." Grace's heart seized. She saw Bruno's finger twitch on the trigger. In that split second, several things happened at once. Bruno whipped his arm toward Vincent, pulling the trigger. At the same time, Grace mustered every ounce of courage and threw her weight sideways against the pillar with a shrill, muffled cry, just enough to draw Bruno's attention a split instant off. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Vincent lunged aside with reflexes honed by a lifetime of danger. The bullet meant for his chest grazed his upper arm instead, tearing through his coat. He staggered but kept his footing. Instantly, the warehouse erupted in chaos. A rifle report sounded from high above, one of Vincent's hidden snipers, secretly in position on a catwalk. Bruno's man with the snake tattoo went down before he could fire at Grace, a precise shot to his shoulder disarming him. Another of Bruno's men opened up with an automatic burst from behind crates. Vincent dove behind a steel drum as bullets sparked off the concrete. Grace could only watch in terror as a firefight exploded around her. She was helplessly exposed against the pillar. Bruno, cursing, retreated toward her, seizing her shoulder and pressing the barrel of his gun to her temple. "Everyone hold your fire!" Bruno screamed, his voice raw. "Or I swear I'll kill her." The shooting tapered off. A tense silence fell again, punctuated by the drip of Bruno's henchman's blood pooling from the sniper's hit and the distant wail of a bullet ricochet. Grace's pulse thundered in her ears. Bruno was using her as a human shield now, his arm vice-like around her neck. She met Vincent's gaze across the dim space. He had taken cover not far away, and she saw with horror that blood was seeping through his sleeve from the grazing wound. But his focus was entirely on the barrel pressed to Grace's head. "Let's all just calm down," Vincent said, remarkably steady despite the gun pointed at the woman he cared about. His raised hands were faintly stained red, presumably from checking his wound, and his face was pale but determined. "Bruno, you don't want to do this. You shoot her, you lose your only bargaining chip. There's no way out then." Bruno panted behind Grace, his chest heaving against her back. "Shut up. I'll do it. I'll kill her right now." The muzzle dug painfully against Grace's temple, making her whimper. Vincent's eyes never left hers. "Bruno," he continued carefully, "think about what your father would say." That made Bruno hesitate. Grace felt the pressure of the gun ease just a fraction as Bruno barked a humorless laugh. "Don't you dare talk about my father, Caruso. He respected loyalty," Vincent said softly. "He wouldn't have wanted this." Bruno growled, his arm trembling. Grace sensed his desperation mounting. She knew Vincent was trying to stall and de-escalate, but Bruno seemed beyond reason. Her own fear had crystallized into a kind of clarity. If she did nothing, Bruno might very well shoot her out of spite. And even if not, one of Vincent's men might take a risky shot and she'd end up in the crossfire. She had to create an opening. Trusting Vincent and raw instinct, Grace suddenly drove the back of her heel down onto Bruno's foot as hard as she could. At the same time, she flung her head backward. Her head struck Bruno's chin. He yelled in pain and surprise. His grip loosened just enough. In that blink, Grace tore free of his arm and dropped into a desperate duck. A single gunshot rang out, Grace hit the concrete floor hard, her shoulder exploding with pain, but she was clear of Bruno. Bruno stood for an instant, eyes wide with shock. A crimson rose blossomed on his chest, right where a sniper's bullet had found its mark. He staggered, the gun slipping from his fingers, clattering harmlessly to the ground. With a strangled gasp, Bruno collapsed onto his back. It was over as fast as it began. Grace lay on the cold floor, stunned, until strong hands gently turned her over. Vincent was there, dropping to his knees beside her, ignoring his own injury entirely. "Grace," he breathed, and within moments he had a knife out, slicing through the ropes that bound her to the pillar and the tape around her wrists. His hands shook just a little as he peeled the tape from her mouth for the last time. Grace sobbed in relief and flung her freed arms around him, clinging as if he might vanish. "I knew you'd come," she managed to choke out between sobs. The sheer relief of being alive and safe in his arms overwhelmed her. Vincent held her fiercely against him. "I'm so sorry," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I let this happen to you." Grace pulled back just enough to meet his gaze. "It's not your fault," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. Only then did she notice he was bleeding. "You're hit. You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her. Up close, the graze on his upper arm looked nasty but not deep. "Just a scratch." His eyes roamed over her frantically, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "No," Grace said, though her cheek smarted and her body was sore all over. "I'm okay." Vincent exhaled a breath of profound relief and cradled her face between his hands. "I was so afraid," he admitted, his composure cracking. "When I realized Bruno had you, I thought I might lose you, Grace." Grace's heart swelled. She saw raw fear and affection in his eyes, and realized in that moment just how much he cared. "You saved me," she whispered. "You kept your promise." He managed a small, shaky smile. "Always." Behind them, Angelo and a few of Vincent's men were moving through the warehouse, disarming the remaining conscious henchmen and checking on the wounded. The immediate danger had passed, and Vincent's crew had clearly gained control. But Grace and Vincent were cocooned in their own world. Carefully, Vincent helped her to her feet. She swayed, and he steadied her, keeping an arm around her protectively. As they made their way toward the exit, Grace glanced back at Bruno's fallen form, where two of Vincent's men now stood over it, confirming the betrayal's grim end. She shuddered and turned her face into Vincent's shoulder to block out the sight. "Don't look," he murmured gently, guiding her outside. In the cool, pre-dawn air of the alley, emergency vehicle lights flashed blue and red. It seemed someone, perhaps a neighbor who heard the gunshots or Vincent's people, had alerted the police. But Vincent's influence was already at work. A couple of officers nodded deferentially at him and did not interfere as he escorted Grace to a waiting car. Within minutes, they were driving away from the chaos, leaving Bruno's final gamble behind. Only when they were a safe distance away did Vincent finally sag back in the seat and pull Grace tightly into his embrace. She nestled against him, closing her eyes, absorbing the steady beat of his heart under her cheek. "It's over," he murmured, almost as if convincing himself. His lips brushed the top of her head. "You're safe now." Grace tilted her face up, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, Vincent," she said softly, "for coming for me, for everything." He cupped her cheek with tender care. "There's nothing I wouldn't do for you, Grace. Don't you know that by now?" The intensity of his words sent a warmth coursing through her. Despite everything, the kidnapping, the terror, at this moment she felt an overwhelming surge of happiness and love. Maybe it was the adrenaline or the closeness of nearly losing each other, but Grace found herself rising up and pressing her lips to his in a gentle, trembling kiss. Vincent inhaled sharply, then answered her kiss with equal tenderness. His hand slid to the nape of her neck, holding her as if afraid she might disappear. The world around them fell away. No crime lords, no danger. Just the two of them confirming in one sweet, desperate kiss what words had yet to fully express. When they finally parted, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. Both of them were breathing unsteadily, but he was smiling. That rare, genuine smile that lit his gray eyes like silver in sunlight. Grace smiled back, a soft laugh of pure relief escaping her. "You're incredible," he whispered, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "You know that? You saved my life back there too," distracting him. "You're as brave as they come, Grace Delaney." She flushed, shaking her head modestly. "I was so scared." "Yet you still fought," he said, pride in his voice. "My little heroine." Grace's cheeks warmed at the endearment. She curled into his side, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake her as the adrenaline ebbed. Vincent held her close the entire ride back, never once letting go. 6 months later, a gentle summer sunset cast gold and pink hues over the city skyline. From the balcony of Vincent's penthouse, Grace watched the lights of Manhattan begin to twinkle one by one as dusk settled. In the reflection of the glass railing, she saw Vincent approach from behind, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. He offered one to her with a soft smile. "To new beginnings," he said. Grace accepted the flute and clinked it lightly against his. "To us," she added warmly. They sipped in comfortable silence for a moment, gazing out at the breathtaking view. So much had changed in 6 months that it still amazed Grace. After Bruno's death and the fallout of his betrayal, Vincent had solidified his position and purged the remaining corruption from his ranks. True to his word, he'd steered many of his operations towards legitimate ventures, with Grace's help. She had officially become Vincent Caruso's financial consultant, but everyone in his circle knew she was far more than an employee. She was his trusted partner. The suspicious murmurs that had greeted her initially, an outsider in the inner sanctum, had long since quieted after she proved her savvy time and again optimizing the businesses. Even the most traditional of Vincent's capos had come to respect the young woman who had saved their boss's life and enriched the family's coffers, in entirely legal ways no less. Grace had also, with Vincent's loving insistence, finished her degree. In fact, her graduation ceremony was just a week ago. She remembered how Vincent had attended in person, watching proudly from the crowd as she walked across the stage. Afterward, he'd swept her into a tight hug despite the public setting, whispering, "I'm so proud of you," in her ear. She sighed contentedly and leaned on the balcony rail. Far below, traffic glittered and flowed. It struck her how much her perspective had shifted, both literally and figuratively. Once she'd felt lost and small, serving cocktails to the rich. Now she stood confidently beside one of the most powerful men in the city, her own skills and voice valued. And, she mused with a smile, her heart full. Vincent set down his glass and slid an arm around her waist. "Penny for your thoughts?" he murmured, nuzzling gently against her temple. Grace turned to face him, slipping her free hand inside his suit jacket to rest against his chest. "I was just thinking how I never imagined any of this," she said, gaze shining. "If you hadn't asked me that ridiculous question about business that night at Giovanni's." Vincent chuckled, a deep, pleasant sound that still made her stomach flutter. "Ah, yes. My poor attempt at humor that turned out to be the best investment strategy I've ever had." Grace laughed. "An investment in a waitress." "An investment in you," he corrected, brushing a strand of her hair behind her ear. "And it paid off beyond my wildest dreams." She felt her eyes prick with happy tears. "For me too," she whispered. Vincent's face grew serious in the golden light. He carefully took her champagne flute and set both glasses aside. Then he took her hands in his. "Grace, there's something I want to ask you." Her heart skipped. His tone, the tender intensity in his gaze, it made her breath catch. "I know a life with me wasn't what you planned," Vincent said softly. "It's not the easiest road, but you've been my light through dark times, and my partner in building something better. I can't imagine my world without you in it." He reached into his pocket and slowly sank down on one knee. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, eyes wide in astonished joy. Vincent revealed a small velvet box, opening it to display a ring, a solitary diamond on a simple, elegant band that sparkled with internal fire. His own eyes shone up at her as he spoke, voice a touch unsteady for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. "Grace Delaney, will you marry me?" Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she answered, hardly before he'd finished speaking. "Yes, Vincent, of course I will." A rare look of relief and pure happiness broke across his face. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. Then rose, and Grace threw her arms around him, sealing her answer with a heartfelt kiss. They stayed entwined, foreheads touching, as the last edge of sun dipped below the horizon. Grace couldn't stop admiring the ring, not for its material worth, but for what it symbolized, how far they'd come from that fateful evening. "Mrs. Caruso," Vincent murmured, testing the sound of it and chuckling when Grace's blush returned. He cradled her cheek, eyes full of love. "You've made me the happiest man alive." "And you've made me the happiest woman," she replied sincerely. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat, the heart of a man who had been feared by many, but whom she knew in all his facets, the formidable leader, the fiercely protective lover, the thoughtful partner. Their journey had been anything but ordinary, a mix of danger, laughter, and passion. But it led them right here, to this moment of shared hope. As they gazed out at the shimmering lights of their city, Vincent wrapped his arms around his future bride from behind. Grace leaned back against him with a content sigh. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked softly. It was a question he'd posed in different ways before, out of lingering guilt for the dangers she faced with him. Grace shook her head and smiled. "Not one bit. The path that brought us together might have been unexpected, even crazy. But I'd do it all again. It led me to you." Vincent pressed a gentle kiss to her hair. "And you to me." In the distance, the Chrysler Building's spire lit up, casting a glow over the skyline. The city hummed with life below. But here in their elevated sanctuary, it felt like their own little world. Grace interlaced her fingers with Vincent's, the diamond of her engagement ring catching the light. She thought of the shy waitress she'd been, struggling and uncertain, and the confident woman she'd become, loved and in love. Who would have believed that a mafia boss's offhand joking question would lead to this kind of fairy tale? "Life sure is full of surprises," she mused aloud, echoing words Vincent once said. He chuckled, recognizing the callback, and gave her a light squeeze. The best ones, anyway. Together they stood watching the night unfurl over New York, ready to face the future side by side. Whatever challenges might come, they had each other, an unlikely pair bound by trust, courage, and a love born from the most unexpected of beginnings. And for Vincent and Grace, that was the greatest investment of all, one that would last a lifetime.